Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last session of the 2023 annual conference of the Hawaii Economic Association. My name is Jack Siderhout, and I'm pleased to be able to moderate this session on economic forecasting. Given the chaotic times that make up the economy these days, forecasting is more important than ever. And we are pleased that our panelists have taken up the challenge of providing forecasts and sharing their insights with us here where the economy is headed in the near future. When our panelists agreed to do this, neither the Maui fires nor the Hamas war were in the picture. And since then, of course, Hawaii and our world have become much more chaotic. Let's see how this has impacted their forecasts. Our panelists are well known to all of us here, but if you're new and you're not familiar with them, I invite you to take a look at their bios in the program. Our panelists in order of presentation will be Eugene from DBED, who will take a kind of broad national, broad state look at things. And then Peter from UHERO will take some of these ideas and develop them further and apply them to Hawaii and more local application. Mike will be doing the commercial real estate sector that we're always very much interested in. And then Paul will take a deep dive into labor markets and monetary policies. And I think all of us know what a deep dive to Paul is. So get ready to hold your breath. The presentations, I've asked the presenters to keep it within 15 minutes, and I'll do my best to try to enforce that. And that'll leave us about a half hour for Q&A, which should be pretty exciting. So without further ado, let's start with Eugene. And we'll be doing PowerPoint slides. How about that? How could we not?
Good afternoon. So this format changes. I think the previous panels has no PowerPoint, but we do have a lot of numbers. First, let me start. I will first give you the high-level summary about our local economy, but I will start with a forecast just released 3 days ago from Blue Chips Economic Indicators. So you can see the first line is the US economic growth, 2.2% for this year, 1.1% for next year. So people are more pessimistic for next year, but most of the economy will have a decline in the next year. But keep in mind, by the end of last year, people forecast this year the economic growth was 0.3%. And in January, they revised to 0.5%. And now from 0.5 to 2.2. So with that, do you still want me to continue or you want me to go home? With this so many, a big degree of uncertainties, is very difficult to forecast the economy. But I will just let you know what is happening in our economy. There are bright spots in the economy. And the first bright spot is the general excise tax collections. I did adjust it for inflation, deflated by the Honolulu CPI-U. We do have data up to September. We did have a decrease in August with 8.7% decrease in the nominal terms, but September increased by 2.3%. The inflation rate released yesterday for Honolulu is 2.2. So you can see that the real growth for general excise tax is still a positive 0.1%. Another thing is the US Bureau of Economic Analysis has been revising the GDP number. The most recent revise is 2017 to 2022, but they didn't revise the quarterly. For the first quarter, Hawaii has been doing good. Actually, for the first half year before the wildfire, Hawaii has been doing good in several aspects. One is the GDP growth. First quarter, we were 2.1%, while the US 1.8%. personal income growth is still good. For the first half year, we grow 5.7%. The US is 5.7%. That compares with 4% average in the last 20 years. Remember, council revenue always use 4% for the outer years. That is mainly based on the personal income growth. So we were at 5.7% for the first half year. And the next slide shows another bright spot in our economy is the construction. Construction industry is booming. And for the data we tabulated for the previous 12 months, the increase is almost 37%, so 36.9%. So the construction industry, the total dollar value is about $11 billion in 2022, and it's continued to increase. Honolulu County and Maui County increased the most. The other two counties decreased. So as an indicator, if you look at the construction jobs, this is seasonally adjusted data. Actually, the January 2023, we had the historical high level of jobs. It's about 38,000. And other months until August, the number is pretty much level, but it's not declining. This slide is actually, I have to apologize, it's kind of small. I just want to show you some samples of our construction project. In this list, I think later on the slide will be posted on HEA website. And for those online, on Zoom, you actually can see this slide. We do have a variety of projects. There are 5 hotel projects, is more than $20 million. And we do also have the Ho'opili Koa Ridge on the list. And we also have a few affordable housing, and we have 4 renewable energy project, a solar energy project. So another bright spot is unemployment rate. We have data up to August. September number will be released next week. Up to August, the unemployment rate for Hawaii, we were 2.8% versus 3.8% as compared with the nation. And in terms of Honolulu consumer inflation released yesterday, we were at 2.2%. We were 1.5% lower than the nation. I think these are good news for the state. Although we have impact from the Maui wildfire, we do see a surprisingly big number for initial unemployment claims is about 14,000 to 15,000. But half of these are reduced work hours. About 7,000 of them are really unemployed without earnings, without wages. And look at the labor market by the payroll jobs. Our recovery for the first 8 months is about 96.1%. The decrease, the most falling behind is manufacturing, financial activities that include real estate, and also retail trade. I think it will take a long time for the payroll job to recover. I think mainly some of the panelists will cover that we do see a big increase in the self-employment, in the new businesses registration, and that people are moving from payroll jobs into their own businesses. Another indicator is our hires. The bottom line, the green line, shows that it has been stable to about 20,000 a month. Although the opening is still high, we still have a high vacancy rate, but the trend is declining. So it's difficult to hire people with the current amount of people looking for jobs. And we have a pretty stable 20,000 a month hired. The job openings mostly is in the healthcare and professional services. Those jobs need a lot of training and education. So we don't have enough candidates. Tourism recovery, you can see that in terms of arrivals, the US has been 10% for the first 8 months, 10% higher than 2019 levels, and others are still recovering. Japan is 32.2%, but in terms of real visitor expenditure, we are still falling behind. This is deflated by DBET tourism price index we developed and released earlier this year. Looking at the seat capacity, we have been stable at about 98, 99%. In the middle line, the blue line, the top line shows the domestic from US mainland. So you can see that we still have about 12.5% higher than the 2019 level. International recovery is about 65%. But because domestic declining, international increasing, they pretty much offset. So you look at the middle line, the total is pretty much a stable level. So let's continue on what happened to Maui. Look at the Maui visitor. This is an indication of the visitor because I want to show what happened to the most recent. We have the average daily passenger count. This is domestic from the US mainland. We did see a decrease by 5,000 for Maui from 7,000, but now it's increased to about 42, 43,000. 4,000 to 4,300. So if you look at the right line, if it goes like this, by the end of the year or maybe in early next year, Maui will be recovered. So the decrease on Maui visitors, there are three factors. One is Maui visitor has been declining since March, even before the wildfire. It's a relocation of the airline flights. They relocated from Neighbor Island to Oahu. Oahu has an increase. So this is the first reason. Second reason is that normally every year during the second half of August, it started a shoulder season. So you can see it's already declined during the wildfire, then it's continued to decrease. So the second reason, the third reason, of course, is the Maui wildfire. So let's look at what happened to Honolulu. You can see the red line is this year, 2023, the daily passenger count increase is continued to increase. This is mainly because of the relocation of the flights, because of the increase in Honolulu, and also some relocation since the wildfire to Kona on the Big Island. There is no flight to Hilo. There was only one, but they all started since February. You can see the red line, the decrease wasn't that significant. It's because at the same time, we have loss on Maui and we have an increase on Oahu. So in terms of this air seat, the passenger count for international, the previous slide shows the domestic US mainland, and the international, the increase wasn't as we expected. It's slower. And we did expect when we did the projection, the United Airlines will resume the flight from Tokyo to Honolulu, but it didn't happen. But the good news is that Delta Airlines is going to resume the flight from Tokyo to Honolulu this quarter. And we also see there will be a resume from Hawaiian Airlines and Japan Airlines from Tokyo to Kona. Another good news is that there is an airline called Air Premier. It's going to start at the end of this year, a new flight from Seoul to Honolulu. It's 4 flights per week going forward. Let's continue. And this is talking about the real estate is the home sales. We do see that home sales decreased by 35.3%. This is the first half year based on the data from Land Court, that including all the multiple listings and also the sales by those Craigslist or Facebook or between friends and relatives or off the market. So every record is included. We decreased by 35.3%, but the average price decreased by only about 4.3%. So we do see the price is not decreasing proportionally. So the last slide I have I will leave more time to Paul Brubaker, who tell more details. Our forecast, you can see, I want to bring your attention to the population. We do forecast a decrease in population in 2023. It will be very small increase in 2025. So then visitor arrivals, we forecast about 9.7, 9.8 million. This is small, bigger than your hero forecast, and it's mainly because we expect the international, especially Japan, will recover sooner. And the Japanese exchange rate, if you look at the exchange rate, currently is about 150. $1 get 150. It used to be 120. Beginning of the year, 140. Now is very expensive to travel to Hawaii. We expect that situation will be better with the Fed may has a high probability that they may remain the interest rate. And also look at the non-agricultural really selling jobs, these zero jobs, is not going to recover. It should be around 26 or beyond. It's not going to recover. It's not going to until 2025. And also, when you look at the GDP growth, we expect it's small, but we expect the increase next year is because the federal money will be coming in. And the federal already allocated $1.5 billion for removing the risk amount, and that is it's good for 6 months. It's good for 6 months. It's going to extend, and it would be $100 million already other programs amount. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Peter Flecky. Thank you for inviting me to talk about real estate, economic conditions. The title slide shows last title report that released a couple weeks ago, and it's very much focused on Maui. Before I to Maui, let me first zoom out and look at the national stage. The U.S. labor market has been really robust, really strong. After the pandemic, we have essentially recreated many of the jobs that the pandemic. So the initial strength was obvious. The blue line shows the monthly average job in the U.S. economy. The orange line shows the labor force. Labor force also peaked actually, but a year ago you may remember we talked about labor force. This is a period when the labor force and the job growth remained very strong. Was fueled by demand. Many consumers in the U.S. saved up a little bit money during the pandemic, and they wanted to spend it afterwards. And that of course led to the job creation. In the last year, labor force and the job gains have been similar pandemic levels. The horizontal line shows you what was the average level before the pandemic. So we are still creating slightly more jobs, many more, still at least the same number of people are returning on the labor force than before the pandemic, which bodes well for the growth. When I burst through the slide, it shows you the US inflation, that's the blue and orange line, and the orange line that when I first looked at this slide, I was amazed how long it start hiking rates. The inflation was at 8%, the Fed from 0%. So it took a really long time, and I still see that in Seattle hiking cycle in tandem with inflation. And last this recovery talked about inflation, and so it took a long time to actually start fighting inflation. Inflation peaked around at 9%, and then it has fallen back to about 3.5% now, approximately. which is still above the Fed's target 2% rate. And it seems it's going to be harder to push inflation lower from this point forward. Once people start believing that inflation is not transitory but stays with us, it's much harder to fight it. And while no one believed that inflation is going to be at 8%, 3.5 sounds much more plausible. And as we can see, the last couple data points in the blue line were actually upticks. And in fact, our forecast, when we released it, we were more optimistic. We thought it's going to come down faster. Another thing that actually surprised me when I looked at the market expectations about the next Fed hike, 1 month ago, about half the the chance of another hike was about 40%. Yesterday, it was less than 10%. So despite the fact that we have strong labor market, fairly stable, but not 2% inflation, market participants expect that the Fed is not going to hike next time when they meet, which is surprising to me. Okay, so the strong economic conditions, high inflation, Fed rate hikes, these all lead to higher bond yields and mortgage rates. Now, the high mortgage rates are now really at 20-year highs, and they hurt the home resale market, among other things. Also, the commercial real estate, which we'll hear about soon. But the home resale market is affected in two ways. On the demand side, people who are thinking about buying a house are now facing the high mortgage rate, which is essentially part of the cost. So they are stepping back and holding off buying a house. And the people who own a house at a 2.5%, 3% mortgage, they are not willing to give up their mortgage. They are locked in at a good rate, and so they keep their house. So that's the supply side. So both sides are hurting the home resale market and mobility in some sense. There are many other headwinds that the U.S. consumer is potentially facing: high oil prices, and chaos in Congress. But despite all of these things, the US consumer has been spending, and the consumer spending in the US was the factor that actually got us through this strong recovery. What you see on this slide in blue line on the left is the personal saving, and there's two shades of blue. The light blue is pre-revision and the dark blue is after a recent revision of the data. They're not very different. What's important is that the orange line is the trend that would have been the normal saving for consumers through the pandemic. But instead, what happened was people couldn't spend their money because everything was closed, everything was locked down, but we were getting lots of government support, and all that went into savings. And so on the right-hand side, you see this huge increase in accumulated savings. So all those savings that we accumulated during the pandemic, we then started spending in more recent times. And so on the left-hand side, you see that the saving has fallen below the orange line, meaning we are now saving less than would have been predicted by our regular behavior before the pandemic. And on the right-hand side, you see that our accumulated savings are dwindling. And again, a dark blue line is the revision that we obtained recently. So it shows that we are not at the bottom yet, but we are approaching that bottom. And once we use up all our accumulated savings, it could take off about 0.5% of GDP growth, where GDP is already growing slightly less than the potential GDP growth would be. So that's looking at macro conditions nationwide. Now, looking at Hawaii, this slide shows us the major visitor markets in Hawaii. The dark blue line is the US market, which has been the one that actually carried the tourism industry for the past 2 years, has been very strong. Right after the pandemic was over, US visitors returned in greater numbers than before the pandemic. These lines are indexed to the pre-pandemic level. So the 100 is the pre-pandemic norm. But then if you look towards the end of the blue line, even before the last data point, which is affected by the Maui fire, US visitor arrivals have been tilting lower. The green and the light blue lines are other major markets outside Japan. They have been pretty good. They recovered essentially to pre-pandemic levels. So we are happy with the arrival of those visitors. What's puzzling, or not puzzling, but somewhat disturbing, is that the Japanese visitors haven't returned in the numbers that we would have expected. They started recovering later, and the trend up is much slower. And the question is, why is that? And is this normal? So looking at past, this is showing Japanese visitor arrivals over the past 30, 40 years. And whenever there was a shock or those downward spikes, typically the Japanese market recovered fairly quickly. There was a structural break after the Asian financial crisis, at which point, up to that point, we have had strong growth of Japanese visitors. After that, they started dwindling. Part of it is obviously population related, demographic related. What's surprising is that before the pandemic, Japanese arrivals have been fairly steady, despite the fact that the population has been declining. But then, of course, what we see now is very different from what we have seen in earlier shocks or crises. And one of the main reasons why that's happening is the weakness of the yen. So in this slide, what you see is, again, these lines are indexed to 100 just before the pandemic. And so the 135 means that the yen is now 35% weaker, or you have to pay 135 yens for $100. That's actually, that's the exchange rate. So the yen is 35% weaker than before the pandemic. Okay, so even if we forget about the fact that room rates have increased and the cost of food, and in general, the US has experienced much higher inflation than Japan, even if we abstract from the price increases, just comparing the cost of a Hawaii trip to what it would have cost 3 years ago or 4 years ago, a Japanese visitor has to pay 35% more in yen. Now, if you add to that the fact that room rates are higher and everything is more expensive, then easily the Japanese visitor, the trip for the Japanese visitor is 50, 60% more than it used to be before the pandemic. And that clearly has an effect on their attitude towards traveling to the US and then to Hawaii. Now, looking at Maui, the big spike down is the fire. And what you see here is the number of deplaning passengers. This is the highest frequency data that we have about visitors. And even before the fires, if you squint, you can see that that line is trending down somewhat. And part of the reason might have been the fact that room rates on Maui were in excess of $600 per night. And so, of course, there was some trade-off, and occupancy rates were not as high as on the other islands either. So Maui has seen some weakness even before the fire, but then after the fires, obviously, arrivals and visitor presence on the island dropped by 75%. So that's the immediate shock. After that, we have seen some recovery to about 50% of pre-fire levels of deplaning passengers. One thing to keep in mind, yes, this line is slightly above 50% recovered, but deplaning passengers include residents, emergency workers, construction people. So it's not just visitors. So it's other people on the planes too. Now, if you compare this to what we expected to happen before the fire, so the orange line here is our pre-fire forecast. Obviously, it's a huge difference. And what might look weird is the fact that the fourth quarter is actually lower than the third quarter. Now, the reason why that's the case is because the third quarter was only partially impacted by the fires, right? The fires happened about halfway through the quarter. So the fourth quarter is really fully affected by the fires. But we already see a recovery, as I showed you on the previous slide. And we should be able to get through a good recovery in the foreseeable future for several reasons. As I mentioned, the Maui occupancy rates were about 65% before the fires. Compare that to the rest of the island, 75%. So there was plenty of room on Maui to accommodate visitors. The other thing is that the east side of the island has been open to visitors, and now we have seen the west side partial opening, which allows potential travelers to plan ahead, right? That's important that they can start planning their trips.
Further out, 1-2 years from now, we will be in a situation if we didn't build enough homes for those who were displaced by the fires. There's going to be competition between them and visitors, right? The rooms that are currently available are not fully occupied. But once we have enough visitors, there's potentially a conflict between renting the room to visitors or keeping the displaced residents. So that's why it's very important that replacement housing happens soon. Just to highlight how important tourism is for Maui, if you look at this figure, the statewide tourism spending, about 33% or about 1/3 of that is spent on Maui. So that's more than Kauai and Big Island combined. So clearly there's a lot of tourism spending happening on Maui. In fact, about 40% of Maui's GDP is associated with tourism. And so clearly Maui has been hit really hard by the absence of visitors. You can see it in, for example, by looking at the labor market conditions on Maui. So again, this is one of the higher frequency data that we have about the labor market. It's initial claims in orange bars and continuing claims, the blue line. Obviously, after the fire, initial claims spiked as all the jobs in Lahaina area were lost. And then these job losses accumulated, and that's what the blue line indicates, that we have now about 10% of the Maui labor force is jobless. Luckily, we see some flattening of the blue line up there. And that means that even though we still see initial claims, meaning people still losing jobs, others are finding jobs. So there's some churn in the labor market. And the reason why we still see some initial claims is because although the initial impact was in the Lahaina area, because of the lack of visitors, the rest of Maui is suffering too, and there's job losses elsewhere on the island also. And so that's what this figure illustrates. All right, so longer horizon, the labor market is gonna have a fairly quick recovery, faster than tourism. You see the spike down, and then by the end of next year, we might be about at the same level as before the fire. The main reason for this is gonna be the construction industry. All the industries associated with tourism will keep suffering, they will suffer, right? So the accommodation and food, trade, transportation and utilities might benefit from the cleanup and initial rebuilding. And then eventually when rebuilding starts in earnest, then the construction industry will contribute a lot to the job recovery on Maui. If you are comparing the Maui conditions, labor market conditions to the rest of the state, then this clearly shows the contrast. The blue line is Maui unemployment rate, and the orange line is the unemployment rate in the rest of the state. So clearly it's a Maui issue. And in fact, once reconstruction begins, we might actually see people moving from the other islands to Maui to help with the rebuilding. And so the unemployment rate in the rest of the state is going to be flat, steady. On Maui, it's going to spike to about 10% and then gradually slide lower, but it's not going to get back to those levels that we have seen either before the pandemic or before the fire. Now, about the rebuilding effort. So even before the fire, we have seen a huge amount of planned construction in the state. So the orange line is our forecast before the fire. And that line is higher than what we have seen before the pandemic. It's even higher than what we have seen during the housing bubble. So we have already been planning to see a huge increase in construction before the fire. And now with the fire, obviously initially there's going to be cleanup, so no construction initially, but once construction starts, there's going to be a huge demand for labor, for materials, and in absence of availability of labor and materials, we will see increases in prices. And we have heard about that in the previous session too. So construction is going to get really expensive really soon. And the other thing is that this is going to last for a while. So it's not going to be a 1-2 year deal. It's going to be dragged out for a while. On the flip side, some of the government contracts that have been planned, they might need to be delayed, right? So something will have to give. Okay, so the overall picture of what we expect in the next couple of years. The blue line shows you Hawaii's population, which has been declining for 5-6 years now. We'll see a little bit more of that decline, in part because some displaced residents from Maui will ultimately move away from the state. Some will move to other islands, but some will move away from the state. The orange bars are our forecast for GDP growth before the fire, and the blue bars are after. And the blue bars are eventually higher than the orange bars. And the reason is because in some weird sense, the fire creates rebuilding, more economic activity, and that's going to lead to actually faster economic growth down the line, but not in the near term. So this year and next, we still expect the effect of the lack of visitors, the decline in the tourism industry to prevail and be the stronger negative force. So before I stop, let me just show you what my colleagues have done. They are working on, or they have created a dashboard showing you neighborhood level housing related statistics. And so the way to get to the dashboard is to go to our website and then go to data. And one of those items in that list is the dashboard. And after the initial front page, you can actually choose your own neighborhood, your own zip code. Or if you want to have a more aggregate view, you can just pick an island. And once you pick an island, you can choose certain aspects of the data that you want to look at, or perhaps download. And then after that, you get to a page that shows you in 3 columns, 3 different aspects of your neighborhood. It could be demographics, could be permits related, could be rents related. And so you can switch the different views by clicking on certain, these blue bars down there. And then those bars, actually this messed up, but the vertical bars that you see there, they are comparisons of your neighborhood to the rest of the state, kind of giving you an idea of where you are, where your neighborhood is relative to the rest of the state. And thank you for your attention.
Okay. My eyes may not be as good as these other gentlemen, so I might want to go down on the floor there to read it because I'm just making sure that oh, that's better. Okay, that's good. All right. Okay. My role here is different than the economists. I actually try to use the information they provide us in a more practical use. I'm involved in real estate, commercial real estate in particular, and I think the commercial real estate market is a good barometer of where the business environment is here in Hawaii. The data that I have here primarily will start with the investment market. And we're all well aware of what happened in the residential market. I mean, they mentioned a 30-something% decline in residential home sales. Well, from investment perspective, we also had a dramatic drop of about 36% in dollar volume. That's directly related to the rapid rise in interest rates. We're very vulnerable to what happens with interest rates because people buy properties based on what they can afford from a monthly perspective, and that's basically what's happened here. One of the things that also occurred is that institutional investors pulled out of our marketplace. They're not going to jump into Hawaii, one, because of the uncertainty in the marketplace, and two, we only had, I think, 1 transaction for the first 6 months of the year. As a result, I can't see that number, but it looks like it's about $130 million. That was 1 transaction. And that was actually an affordable housing project. So we don't really count that as commercial related anyway. Hawaii's market in particular is very small investor oriented. So transactions under $10 million are very active. And even through the pandemic and into the end of the first 6 months of this year, 87% of the transactions were for under $10 million. So basically what that means is that you as a small investor still invest in Hawaii fairly actively, despite the fact that mainland investors, foreign investors pull out of this marketplace. The dollar volume breakdown 80% of the dollars spent on commercial real estate were the local entities. In a normal year, the interest rates are lower or even economic aspects are stronger, 80% of the dollar volume is usually US domestic institutional investors. So a dramatic change in our investment market here locally. And then of course, transaction counts, these are sales volume, sales dollars per count, local 80%, very similar to what's happened in the past. Of course, I mentioned how foreign investors in commercial real estate, 0 for the first 6 months of the year. So if the Japanese or the Koreans or the Canadians, they all have challenges, they're not going to look at Hawaii as an investment opportunity, or they haven't. So our investment forecast going forward is that we're going to still see about a 20 to 25% drop off in sales volume for commercial real estate investment in our marketplace. Not exciting news, but if you were to compare it nationally, the dollar volume on a national basis is a 60% drop off in commercial real estate investment activity compared to Hawaii's 20 or 25%. There's still a big difference between those that are interested in buying and what the sellers are willing to sell it at. That's called our bid ask spread. It's widening because if I'm a buyer, I'm looking for discounts. If I'm a seller, I don't want to sell it at a discount. I'm trying to hold on to it. So basically, that's kind of where the commercial real estate marketplace is right now. Office market. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I know it's been a long day. We're going to listen to Paul Brubaker at the end of our presentation here. So this is going to keep us up, right? Okay, office market. Of all the commercial real estate market property types, this is the one that's gone through evolution, transition. The word apocalypse is also in there. Basically, we have vacancy rates rising to about 13.5%. This is the perhaps nearing the highest vacancy rate historically on Oahu. We've had some transition in this market, and it's primarily due to the reduction in office inventory. I don't know how many of you have heard stories that 2 huge office buildings are now being converted from office to residential usage. So our forecast in 2018 was the total office inventory for Oahu was about 14.6 million. And by the end of 2025, will be about 13 million. So we lost 1 million square feet of office space likely to conversions. And that's actually kind of a good thing because in our marketplace, our vacancy rate is actually lower than a national average. I mean, nationally, it's about 16% or about 13%. Other aspects is we look at sublease space as an indicator of our marketplace as well. Nationally, about 12.8% of all available office space on the mainland is sublease space. Locally, it's about 4%. So comparatively speaking, Hawaii or Oahu is a lot healthier than much of the rest of the nation. So our forecast going forward is that it's going to rise to about 14%, which is a record high. I know it's scary when you say, oh, it's hitting a record high, but some of the things that we need to be aware of is that hybrid work environment is still in our midst. Businesses are still re-evaluating whether or not they're going to continue to reduce the amount of office usage. And well, I in particular work from home most of the time, so they don't need my office space in that office building anymore. So going forward, that's a consideration. I mean, that's still a big trend, and I forecast that it's going to continue at least for 2 more years. Because if on average, office leases were about every 5 years and they renew. If I had just renewed prior to the pandemic, it's going to come up in 2025, and that's when hopefully the market begins to stabilize. So that's the forecast for the office sector. Industrial sector. I know all of you, when the stores closed, you guys went to Amazon, right? Amazon is basically a big warehouse, distribution, and delivery, basically, right? So vacancy rates in the industrial sector of all the different property types shrank down to sub 1%. We're looking at 0.8% at the end of the, I think at the end of the year, or end of the second quarter or something like that. Anyway, we're the tightest, we call it tight when there's no space out there, and we're the tightest market in the entire country. That's the lack of available industrial land to develop and also the lack of available space out there in the marketplace. Some of the things that I like to kid about when I talk to my industrial brokers is that there's about 64 listings island-wide. There are about 15 brokers that specialize in industrial. Each broker has 4 listings to work on for the entire year. You make, what, 10,000 bucks per deal? There's a lot of industrial guys going to focus on playing golf. Okay, some of the things that we showcase from an economics perspective is, and this is data from Seth's office, wholesale sales sets a new record high. Peter mentioned retail sales have gone up through the roof. Well, it's primarily because people were saving money and during the pandemic, now they're spending it. And as a result, wholesalers benefit from that. We mentioned about the strength of the construction industry. And as a result, rental rates, if you have lack of supply, strong demand, what happens to prices? They start shooting through the roof. So rents are at an all-time high now. And vacancy rates going forward for the next 6 months or so, going to stay sub 1% because there isn't any speculative development in our marketplace for warehouses. So our vacancy rate at end of third quarter was 0.6 for a little bit of, we call it absorption, which is occupancy growth, and rental rates continue to escalate. Okay, last sector. I know we're going through this pretty quickly. Hopefully you get a good idea of what's strong, what's weak in our marketplace. Retail marketplace. You just heard strong growth in terms of retail sales. Our retail market, which has gone through upheaval as a result of COVID, is on its way back to stabilization. We're bouncing back. Vacancy rates of about 5.8% remains fairly healthy compared to the nation. Job counts continue to recover. Tourism expenditures, as highlighted by our economist, are through the roof. International travel, we talked about the currency exchange. We're not seeing much Japanese in our market. And what else other than the conversion rate being through the roof? And our retail sales have hit a record high. So retail sector, despite all that's happened to them, store closures, COVID, supply chain issues, now a labor shortage and inflation, they've been very resilient in our marketplace. The vacancy rate going forward through the end of the year is about 5.3%. So here's a summary for the third quarter. Ultimately, what we have is a commercial real estate market that's kind of feeling its oats, so to speak. Investment sales are down. Office market suffering from hybrid, but also lots of office conversions into residential. Industrial market, phenomenal in terms of sub 1% vacancy rate, and a retail market that's resilient and recovery. And that's kind of our quick summary of the various commercial real estate sectors. Now we can talk, have Paul share his insights.
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everybody. Hey, a whole screen. I can see my whole screen because there's nobody after me. Okay, here we go. I even have, out of sheer affection, a slide for John Knox because he's going to complain about the economics. Oh, this is me picking on Sean. Okay, we need to get over 2019, you guys. It's not the benchmark. You see what I'm saying? Equilibrium is a trajectory. This is productivity growth. And it was different during the pandemic in that it happened during the pandemic as opposed to after the pandemic when, right, in the jobless recovery, people work harder, so productivity goes up. And it's lower than it was before. You know, in the dot-com era, productivity growth was about 3. Remember we had John from the Fed come speak to us, whose last name all of a sudden I can't remember. Fernald, who's living in France now. Why I oughta. But the path, as I say, is where I think we really should be thinking, because not to get technical, but Hawaii got displaced from its path. The US is going back to its path. That's a huge difference. And you can see that here I've aligned, those are employment indicators. This is employment where different ways to do it. I've aligned to 2019 as the jumping off point, so to speak, for the pandemic. And then on the right-hand side, you can see deviations from the 20-teens trend. So Hawaii's two standard deviations away from the pre-pandemic trend. The US is one standard deviation away and headed back. That's a very different trajectory. I mean, I hope Hawaii gets back, but I'm not hopeful, and I'm going to come back to this at the end. A lot of people have alluded to things I'm going to talk about, which is great because I get to hear what they were talking about and I can tie it into mine. At the NABE meeting earlier this week, over the last weekend, there were some really interesting discussions building on, Nick Bloom built on the working from home literature that is now maturing. Icicle, I can't remember her name, was talking about. So I'll refer to some of the things that are happening in the labor market that help tie together themes that we've heard earlier. So the pandemic there were these bizarre sort of structural features where people who lost their jobs were typically at the low end of the wage spectrum, and so the average wage went up, and that was, a false signal. Things have gone back to the path. Real wages have gone back to the path. These are Hawaii real wages, but underneath the surface are these really interesting structural changes that haven't really been obvious until more recently. David Otter and co-authors have published a paper this spring showing that the lowest decile of workers in the lowest decile of wages, if you benchmark to the end of 2019, which I just said, have had the highest real wage increase of all wage cohorts. And the highest wage earners have actually seen their wages come down slightly. And so you would say, whoa, this is kind of a mystery. I tried to look for evidence of this here in Hawaii without going into the CPS and doing all the work because I'm too lazy. I just grabbed real earnings. These are nominal earnings, and aligned them to the end of 2019, which I said we're not supposed to do anymore. And just to highlight the amount by which food service wages have risen. Now, they've risen as much as professional scientific or professional business services. But if you look at where food service wages were at the bottom of the quarantine period, in the summer of 2020, it's a huge leap. And I don't know about your neighborhood. In my neighborhood, if you drive down to Kailua, it starts at Wendy's, which is offering $15 an hour. And then you get down to McDonald's and it's like $18 an hour. And what's the minimum wage in Hawaii? Who cares? It's $18 an hour at McDonald's, the worst place in Kailua to work, right? So these evidence of this upheaval continues. Peter alluded to the Great Resignation that we saw in the 2021, 22, that arc of job openings that were unfilled, right? That big arc, and the jump in quits as people voluntarily separated, right? The pandemic seemed to shake things loose. And at the low end of the wage spectrum, they said, hell no, I'm not working at McDonald's. You'd have to pay me $18. You have to pay me $20 to work at McDonald's. And McDonald's is paying 18 with the signing bonus, and people, they're still looking for people. At the high end of the skill and compensation spectrum, people were looking for a completely different work arrangement. First of all, we had a simultaneous unplanned experiment in working from home, and the smart kids loved it. Right? And they said, I ain't ever going back to an office if I don't have to. So you see this surge surge upward. I'm sorry, I got this backwards. It surge upward in quits as a percent of separations, the counterpart to which is a drop in hires as a percentage of job openings, right? You see that sort of the thing widens out. These are Hawaii data, and then they come back. Things are going back to normal now. And if you think of it in terms of the beverage curve, which, trust me, I totally ignored when I was a student. Don't think I have ever taught it in Econ 302 at UH. But it's the trade-off between job openings on the vertical axis. It's like a Phillips curve, only instead of inflation on the vertical axis, you've got the job opening rate, which is inversely related to the unemployment rate. Yeah. Lots of unemployment, very few jobs, lots of job openings because the unemployment rate is low. Get it? So the inverse relationship, a normal relationship. What happens in the spring, in 1 month between March and April of 2020? Huge jump in unemployment, but then instead of going back to the beverage curve, we go wandering out into space as job openings just keep going up and up, as people at both ends of the wage spectrum think about where they really want to work if they survive the pandemic and wake up in a new tomorrow. And even if you look at the moment where the PCR pre-flight testing started, the hotel tourism reopened in October 2020, you can kind of discount that hump. And that's like a one-time surge in job openings. So that path going like this, right, to this huge swoosh. And then in the middle of last year, is it 2022, spring of 2022, like a dead weight falling to the ground, 12 months where the thing has just fallen off and is now coming back. That's that period where everybody's kind of scrounging around for the right job. At the low end of the spectrum, so this is for you, John. We actually do teach this in Econ 301. Trust me, nobody gets it. Nobody will ever say the word monopsony again for the rest of their life. But the real world, say in the fast food industry, in most neighborhoods is monopsonistically competitive, right? It's not a plantation town, but it's not a competitive labor market. And in those markets, right, the employment level is determined by equalizing the marginal revenue product of labor with the marginal factor cost of labor, right? That's the vertical line, but that the wage is lowered as supply elasticity increased, right? As people's reservation wages went up and the supply curve people became more picky about their jobs, the wages increased at the low end of the pay scale. If you think about higher productivity jobs where the demand curve is further out, that increase was actually smaller than it was for the low wage jobs. And then Icicle Sahin, that's her name, she had this great paper on Sunday or Monday or whatever it was, talking about what's happening at the high end, which is as people search for amenities, right, they take the jobs that give them what they really want in terms of lifestyle or spending time at home with the kids and not having to do the commute. And Nick Bloom reminds us that people at the high skill, high educational attainment end of the spectrum are willing to take 8 to 10% in pay to get full-time work from home, right? So people look for amenities at the high end. The low wage market got much tighter. And by the way, I looked this up last night. I made the slide. I forgot to stick it in here, so I couldn't bring a new slideshow this afternoon. But Carly, bless your heart, if you're in the audience, there are fewer people in the age, 0 to 30 cohort, let's say, than there are in the 30 to 60 cohort. So to some of the points being made earlier today, when that old bugger retires, the crane operator or whatever they're talking about in the earlier, the guy who with the pail, think about it, right? Climbing to the top of the crane every day. Yeah, that guy, there's not enough, the kids weren't born, which is a whole nother, none of this is going to change as we go forward. But this shift in worker preferences really exerted at least a temporary change. And oh, wow, that looks awful. Is that how it looks to you? Yeah. That's my best slide. Let's try it again. Ooh, snap. What about the next one? Oh, thank goodness. Okay. This one is pre-pandemic. A little sliver on the right-hand side, 10% of workers work from home, 90% of workers never work from home. Here are the new Hawaii data. 75% of those who reported, right? Because some people won't report because they're afraid their boss is going to get a copy of the survey. 75% work at home, 25%, half hybrid, half full-time. That's in Hawaii. In the US, it's 30%. In places like Washington, D.C., it's over half of workers. And we've talked about this before. I love talking about it. Ann Bauslag and I have been talking about it for 3 years, going drinking together, talking about it. The data have stabilized now. the new normal, this is the last 15 months or so of household pulse surveys. And John sent me data correcting my data. So I'm just telling you, this is what I have. So go ask John for his. You can see the pattern has really stabilized. We're in the new normal. It corroborates all this information we've had previously from smartphone mobility data. Remember, Google were publishing these data that they stopped a year ago, but showed that, again, a stabilization into a new normal where people spend less time in workplaces, which means they don't stop at the gym or the restaurant or the retail store on the way home, and more time at home. We see spending data, which grew in leaps and bounds, as many have mentioned, after the fiscal stimuli, the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act at the end of 2020, and then the Biden stimulus in March of 2021. But a gap between non-retail, non-grocery retail spending and spending on in-person services has now normalized. And the way we got away with that is e-commerce, shares of total retail sales on the left, absolute constant dollars on the right, remarkably returning to the pre-pandemic trajectory after this one-time increase. So we just fast forwarded to where we would have been anyway in 2023, 2024, and others. I think Mike mentioned this weird thing where we see way more people applying for an employer ID number because they're TikTok influencers. I don't know what they're doing, but we all thought this was going to come down, right? But no, hysteresis, a change you think is temporary that turns out to be permanent. And against the counter pressure of declining labor force participation, the long-term trend in Hawaii, which is probably going to continue because of aging and so on. Okay, a final comment about monetary policy, because it's sort of the big dog. Inflation is over in Hawaii, get used to it. And if you're worried about 3.7% US headline CPI inflation, boo-hoo-hoo, get over it. It's over, okay? It's gonna take a while for everybody to be happy with where the Fed is, but 2 is the number, and the number is 2, and we're there in Hawaii because Hawaii sucks. The decomposition shows, it gives part of the explanation why the Fed didn't react right away was because it was hard to disentangle the supply factors from the demand factors. And the San Francisco Fed put this analysis together, and you can see the supply factors diminishing, but the demand factors persistent, which is why the Fed is maintaining its posture, and why, until just recently, many market participants thought the Fed would move the overnight rate one more time. But I'm pretty sure the September SEP, the forecast of the FOMC members, or the projections, is reasonably close to what you can expect over the next several years. We're not sure where our star is 2.5%, maybe 3%. I don't know. Seems to be creeping up higher. If you believe AI is going to add to productivity, it should be higher. And quantitative tightening as the balance sheet rolls off without replacement to 60 billion in treasury securities and 35 billion in mortgage backs every month. That source of liquidity in those markets is disappearing. And so the spread in particular from from mortgage rates to treasuries has widened out by 100 basis points. You need to understand where we're at. Half the population has never lived in a time when interest rates rose this fast in 18, 19 months, or when the spread from mortgage rates to, I'm using the 10-year treasury note yield, increased this much, all right? Anybody under 40 has never experienced this in their life. And everybody else was too young to understand when the last time it happened. It was the 70s, we were all shrooming or something. So that spread in particular, that 7.6, 7.7 mortgage rate has an extra 100 basis points in there, partly from QT, but also because, what happened to Silicon Valley, and then everybody took a look at the 2 big banks in Hawaii and said, wait, how much in mortgage? Right? You've got mortgage-backed securities on your balance sheet that you don't have to do a mark-to-market on because they're in the held-to-maturity portfolio. But if you did the mark-to-market, you would need way more capital. And that's what people are concerned about. So blah, 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 blah. I don't know. Can you read it? I barely can. That's what I just said. And finally, maybe it doesn't matter because I started out talking about how the US, this is GDP per capita now. We talked about employment. US GDP per capita is trend stationary. It's gone right back to the pre-pandemic trend, which we kind of matched. Per capita GDP in Hawaii in constant dollars was the same in 2012 as nationwide. It was the same in 2000. We started, sometimes we're above, sometimes we're below, but we're definitely below now. In fact, we took a right turn before the pandemic because we don't build telescopes in Hawaii. We dismantle them. And here's my Ed. What's the guy? Ed, the transportation guy. Brada. Speed hump. Are you serious? We don't build highways in Hawaii. We put speed humps in highways. There's some weird, that's some weird throttling like impulse that's going on. I don't know how else to describe it because when I was a kid growing up, GDP per capita, dude, when I was a child, when I graduated from high school, GDP per capita was 30 or 40% higher than nationwide. We ruled Hawaii. And then I came back and look, John Whitehead governor, oh, the thing went down ever since, brother. Why? We did that. You know what I mean? This is Louisiana. Yeah. Congressman Scalise, good luck with that. And that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. As always, entertaining and informative. And in this case, on time. Well done. All right, so we're going to take questions from the audience at any time. So if you have questions, let me know. And if there are Zoom questions out there, I assume that I'll be given those. So let me start with a question about forecasting the situation on Maui, the impact of the Maui fires. What were your biggest challenges in forecasting what the impact of those fires would be? And do prior natural disasters in Hawaii and elsewhere, such as Hurricane Iniki or the COVID shutdown, help you in answering those questions you might have had about the forecast? Or was it just adding more confusion to it? Either one of you.
Okay, so let me start then. So first we were just trying to take stock, trying to understand what the immediate impact was, looking at loss of property, displacement of residents, trying to quickly understand what's the impact on visitor accommodations. The high frequency data that I showed on my slides helped assess that decline in visitor arrivals. Obviously, the first focus was visitor industry, but then we realized we need to look beyond that because although the tourism industry is very important in Maui, that the industry is connected. You know, people who come visit Maui, they feed the gas station owner, the store owner, and in turn, those people spend money elsewhere in the islands or on Maui. And so this is this trickle-down effect. So long story short, our main challenge was to try to connect the dots and understand what's the immediate impact. We also looked at the campfire in California to understand what can we expect in terms of recovery. The first step is cleanup, trying to understand how long it's going to take. We still don't know, but we were making assumptions. Mm-hmm. And then when rebuilding can begin, what it's going to take to actually rebuild certain parts of Lahaina. And so this was the process we went through and made lots of assumptions on the way.
Okay. Eugene?
I think the most difficult is construction. So we actually talking about the construction, the infrastructure. Tourism, I think, according to the number, it should for Maui, it should recover pretty fast because we identified about 478 hotel rooms or visitor rooms were damaged, is accounted for about only 0.6% of the state total. But the rest of Maui is open. I think the governor announced that starting August 8th, rest of Maui is open. I do expect that the visitor will be coming back sooner, but the construction, it will take a long time. Now is removing the debris, but when the construction really start, that is based on assumption. So we assume that it may start in 2025 and starting that, but the whole reconstruction, it may take 10 years.
Paul? Jim Mack and Frank Koss and I, who have been writing, the Gang of Three have been writing over-tourism pieces, and UHERO has been kind enough to publish them. We wrote a little piece on a kind of a bridge piece while UHERO was busy calibrating so they could get their forecast out. So you can go to their site and see this little essay. I want to make one observation from that essay that I think is really relevant here. The question about Iniki, perhaps as a, you know, are there lessons to draw there? Iniki, of course, happened in September 1992. It took about 3 to 5 years for tourism to get back. McKenna Kaufman and Elon Noy wrote a paper talking about how it maybe by some measures took 18 years to get back. Some of us think that's a little extreme, but it's okay, it's not overnight. What was extraordinary and different about that situation, the hurricane and this situation, is that the hurricane essentially scraped everybody's foundation clean so you could get a front loader in there, pick up all the debris, haul it off to the dump site, and as soon as you got your insurance check, you could rebuild a new house. I talked with Joanne Yukimura the other day, who was mayor at that time, and I was asking her, what was your biggest regret from that period? She said, we should have done the utilities underground. Right, because they got to rebuild everybody got to start from scratch. But putting utilities underground was going to cost them 4 times as much. In the long run, it would have been worth it. But at the time, they're just like, we can't afford it. And by the way, somebody tell Ed Sniffen, somebody please finish that stupid Lahaina bypass. Oh my God, it's got to go all the way. Come on, you get up there, then you turn left, go down the Safeway, and then, but on Kauai, they set up the Office of Emergency Permitting within a month. You know, in that log cabin that Gary Rodriguez built, the UPW guy who went to jail, he was selling log cabins for some reason. So and it was the only thing left standing. So they put this office in there. If you want to rebuild your house, you get a special permit, which was great because then we could track the permits. Bro, the construction, the rebuild peaked, wait for it, in January 1993. Starting in September, the rebuild issuance peaked in 4 months and then had a long tail of about 3 years. This is nothing like that. This is the 9/11 World Trade Center site. The toxic mitigation, I mean, the environmental mitigation alone is going to be a huge problem. Now, my snappy comeback is, what? No enough room on Maui for build house, bro. What? You could just start now, right? Go pick somewhere, go build, bro. What you waiting for? Ooh, we have to meet with the community. Okay, I'm just saying, this is a totally different experience. And I never heard anybody say 2025, but that's scary, right? The tent city cannot live, you know what I mean, for another 2 years.
Yeah. Question, let's see. Sorry about that. Mike, I was going to ask you, the slide on industrial supply and demand. Why that particular class of property is so different from the others?
Well, first off, Oahu in general is a lack of supply of available industrial land for development. Most of it's all built out already, all the way from downtown all the way out to
Caves, bro.
pretty much. So the only available land really for industrial is currently only in Kapolei. So what you don't have is any opportunity for infill. And as a result, all those spaces are already taken. So if you were to develop, you gotta go through the permitting process, the entitlement process, the whole 9 yards, as you know, our housing panel talked about.
Yeah.
But there's also the cost of land, cost of construction supplies, you know, and the soon-to-be shortage of industrial or labor for construction. So you have all these competing factors that keep the supply of available industrial property down. And the reason why it surged was because when retail stores were shut down because of COVID, you guys went out and decided, hey, let's do Amazon. Well, third-party logistics, e-commerce, those are all the sectors that are that had grown during COVID that required expansion of space. So you have, you know, Amazon taking up a whole bunch of land out there, and then you also have, you know, some of these Walmart and Target and all these other large big box stores that, you know, decided to enter the e-commerce marketplace.
Okay, follow-up question for Mike. What happened at Kapalama Military Reservation? Is that Amazon?
That's not Kapalama, but that's actually Sand Island. It used to be Circle Pacific property. Amazon took it over. It was 14.5 acres. They acquired it. They plan on they're already building multi-level industrial distribution facilities, and the top 2 floors are actually for parking of vans that are going to distribute, and all the labor people, you know, the cars that
Electric
work in
vans.
this. Pardon me?
Electric vans.
Yeah,
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 good.
absolutely.
There's a question back there. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing because of the lights.
Hello,
Go
no
ahead.
problem. I have kind of a technical question for Debit New Hero. What are the inputs into your population forecast? Because I'm a little surprised to see it leveling off and troughing pretty recently. And then for the entire panel, what kind of confidence intervals are you putting on your forecast going forward?
Yeah, from the population estimated by the Census Bureau, we have seen the population has been declining since 2018. And with the current situation, we don't expect our population will increase, mainly for 2 factors. One is the US economy is recovering much faster than Hawaii. The US recovered fully in 2021, and we are still recovering. Our economy recovery is only 95%. So this is the economic reason. There's a lot of opportunities on the mainland. And with the Maui wildfire, I think there will be some people, we don't see a significant relocation yet, but I think there will be some relocation to other island or even out of state. So we expect there will be population decrease this year, and there will be level in the future few years.
So yeah, so the question is, why is it leveling off so soon? And yeah, I know. So originally our expectation was that, as Eugene said, that after COVID, opportunities were better on the mainland, so we saw the outflux, and that made sense. And we expected there to be an equilibrium eventually, where, you know, Hawaii picks up enough steam. And the truth is, the rest of yes, as I showed on one of my slides, that Maui is going to be heavily impacted by the fires, but the rest of the state, not so much. So in terms of economic opportunity in the state, outside Maui, this is going to be enough opportunities for the population decline to slow. The other thing is that not everyone who lives in Maui is going to go to mainland. Many of the people will relocate to other islands, which still maintains a certain stability within the state. But we will revisit our population forecast.
That was the experience after Iniki. I remember Leroy Laney saying that 15% of the population left Kauai and then eventually found their way back.
in the Labor Department data, they have the initial unemployment claim. There is a column called agent, it's agent claim, which is those people, they are on the mainland elsewhere, but they claim unemployment and it has to be paid by Hawaii. So I do look at the number, I see only about 10 increase on a weekly basis. Is not a significant increase yet.
I think your second question was about the confidence interval for the forecast. Anybody want to comment on that? Plus or minus?
So we were contemplating about doing scenarios for the third quarter forecast and the fourth quarter forecast. It's not really a confidence interval setting. Rather, we would provide a narrative. What are the assumptions behind a low path and the high path relative to the baseline? What would be the different conditions? What would create such a scenario? In the end, we decided just to stick with our baseline, in part because we didn't have enough hard data to justify our opinions about a low path versus a high path. We just said, let's go with the most likely outcome that we can come to a consensus about. So we haven't actually done these scenarios. We may look at them perhaps in the fourth quarter.
Thank you.
Can I just add something? I know Anne's waiting, but just a second. In the late 70s and early 80s, I lived in the Rust Belt. My first teaching job was at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, right after the breweries shut down. Schlitz, which had been the world's top selling beer 20 years earlier, had gone out. Schlitz, Pabst, and Blatz beer, all had shut down. This feels a lot like Milwaukee in 1980, 81. Watching the Hawaii data, you know, it's like the Detroit thing where you get in conversations. John and I have had this conversation which is, well, you don't have to build any housing. Crisis solved, right? Everybody's leaving. The boomers are going to die. Houses last longer than people. By 2040, no problem. I mean, this scenarios that Peter's talking about, there's some downside risk that we have to think about. And the reason I bring it up is not just to, you know, the role of Leroy Laney will be played by Paul Brubaker, but because you have to think these things through, because it can happen to you. We have the ability to change it. And in a lot of these places, I hear Milwaukee's a cool town now. I've never been back, but sorry, Ann.
My question's for Dr. Tan. In your overview, you talked about one of the big bright spots being construction and being up 35%. But looking at those numbers by county, there was a huge discrepancy. 65% of that was Oahu. Big Island was down 6% and Kauai was down 4%. I just wonder if you had some thoughts on what's going on there. Why are they so against the trend that we see elsewhere?
Yeah, the data we tabulated is the last 12 months, which is starting from September last year, October last year to September this year, and compare with the previous 12 months. So during this period, the building permit, including all the government and private, but those building permit, there are some of them, for example, the highway, the Hawaii DOT highway, they actually awarded $2.6 billion on the Big Island. But those, either they are exempt from a building permit or they haven't even started. They awarded, but they haven't, but I believe they may be exempt. So those building permit is not a complete picture. For example, the Honolulu Rail, they don't need a building permit. So only those they need a building permit, it shows, is an indication that our construction industry is booming. And I think I forgot to mention about the government contract awarded. during the first half year is actually increased by 19%. It's big. We had about $9 billion for the Pearl Harbor improvement, and the Hawaii businesses, we get about 4 billion. So those are not included in the building permit yet. So I think to answer your question, the number shows Big Island, Kauai has some decrease. It may be due to the government contract. If you look at the building permit we issue on the monthly basis, all the categories they increase about 22.1%. So for the private, not including the government. So it may be due to government contract.
Someone, okay.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you could weigh in on the economic implications of HECO and how financially damaged they are. They serve 5 islands, three islands in Maui County. The rates, that potentially people will have to pay. The fact that the way the PUC has it set up right now, Maui County has to bear the cost because it's just by county, whatever incident happens. So if you could just weigh in on that and what you think might happen.
Let me start. We are talking about the Maui reconstruction is going to start around 2025. It is not going to be complete. It's going to start. Actually, it's already started because the federal government allocated 1.5 billion for removing the debris, and they have a time limit. So the time limit is 6 months. It's likely they are going to extend it, but federal government money is always have some limit. And I believe there are some money also for Hawaii Electric to do the construction or rebuild those electricity facilities or poles. Those is going to start sooner than later. I think those infrastructure construction, it may come first than the residential. So I think overall construction, it will be coming. I think it's going to start, already started. It's going to start in the next 2 to 3 years.
Anybody else want to take on eco exposure? Okay. All right. Any other questions? Because if not, I have one last question for the panelists. The topic of AI was mentioned several times in this session today. And I'm just curious, to what extent is AI affecting not your forecast, but how you forecast? Are you exploring ways to integrate AI into your forecasting, or is that, are we all too old for that?
So actually, now that you're asking, I just read a paper by researchers at the St. Louis Fed, and they asked ChatGPT, like it wasn't them, it was Google's AI software. They asked them questions. They asked the AI to predict inflation at certain points in the past, and asked the AI to forget about what actually happened afterwards, so that it's fair forecast. It turns out that the AI was making better predictions than the survey of professional forecasters. So we will definitely look into this. That's all I can say.
I think our panel is lined up for next year. Anybody else?
Just as a recovering commercial bank economist, of which there are none now in Hawaii, these things, these changes, they matter. I mean, we built BOH.com, which Peter Kay helped build BOH.com in 1994. You remember Sterling Nakano? I hired him out of my Hawaii's economy class, Jim Mack's class, and he helped code BOH.com in hypertext markup language, this undergraduate kid. And then we went live, and then I realized my days were numbered. Because you didn't need a 10-person research department in a commercial bank And I literally was just talking with, remember Dave Ramser?
Yeah.
My boss. This is how fast things happened. I was trying to get out. I'm going to tell this stupid story and then I'll be done, Jack. I was trying to get out of econ because, you know, there was Dave and then Wally Osmond, right? I was the third string Ben Schwarber quarterback that never got to play even in the fourth quarter. So I'm looking to get a job in financial risk analytics. And I spent a year talking with the CFO and like insinuating my way in there. And like, I know Black-Scholes option pricing theory, kind of. So all of this time we're building the website, I'm realizing, wow, my goose is cooked. You know, we spent $250,000 a year on printing and publishing expense for our reports. When we realized, dude, we're just going to put them up on the website and we'll be done. We'll desktop publish them and we'll put them right on the website. $250,000, shishing, except we never saw it. So, you know, the shareholders got it. And within 6 months, Dave was retired. And my 10-person department, the top 3 people in the department got retired. And there were 7. And then, and in my sort of interview or whatever, they said, you know, were telling me how I'm going to take Dave's job. And I said, let me get this straight. I get my job, the new job you made, and I get Dave's job without the BMW, without the Oahu Country Club membership, without the Wildlife Country Club membership, without the increase in pay. But you're going to make me a vice president instead of an assistant vice president. And I'll never forget, what's his name? He's at Campbell now. The COO looked at me in the face and said, welcome to downsizing. And 4 years later, on the 50th anniversary of the creation of the department in the post-World War II demobilization upheaval of the ILWU strike, Bank of Hawaii went to the President Truman's Council of Economic Advisors and hired a guy, James Shoemaker, to come out to Hawaii, start this research department from scratch. Because in those days, you had to make your own data, right? On the 50th anniversary, that was it. We're done. Shut it down. Brubaker, you can hang around for another 10 years or so, and then we'll retire you. Mark my words, AI is one of those moments. It's 1995. So you best be learning AI before it schools you.
Anyone else want to take, Mike?
Yeah, well, we're already hearing dramatic stories on the mainland in terms of the office market. San Francisco, which is the ground zero for AI, they're anticipating that job growth will return as a result of that because a whole new industry has just sprung up. Very similar to the internet bubble, which happened, you know, back in 2001 in San Francisco. So who knows? That probably will happen where the AI will take your job.
Okay. Well, on that note, I'm happy to say that I'm happily retired and will stay that way. Thank you all very much. Thank our panelists.
So guys, if you've stayed with us this whole entire time, we really appreciate you being here, and we won't apply you with alcohol for after listening to all this economic information. So please come to the happy hour and just talk through what we've learned today. I think we had some great panels, and I really appreciate it. I really appreciate all of your participation and sticking around. So mahalo. And again, thanks to our sponsorships. Things like this are very difficult to do without sponsorship. So we owe them a little round of applause. So thanks a lot, guys. Thank you.
Please fill out the feedback form. There's a QR code on the back of your agenda. Take a picture of that. Thank you everybody for joining us today. As Seth said, meet us over at Giovanni Pastrami's after this. Thanks everybody.